Hello and welcome to our webinar, Great KPIs in 7 Steps. Great to have everyone on the call. I see we've got registrants spanning from Ecuador through Saudi Arabia and many other countries as well. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Bernie Smith. I'm going to briefly introduce myself in a moment. But before I do, what I'd like to do is to dive into the problem that we're going to be trying to solve in today's session. And the way I'm going to do this is using a photograph, a not particularly great photograph, but I think it illustrates the point quite nicely. This picture is one that I took when I was on holiday in the Canary Islands many years ago. And what we can see is a village street with a recently resurfaced road. And if you notice, the local authority that resurfaced it took the trouble to lay the sidewalk or pavement, depending on where you are in the world, in a careful wavy pattern around 30 or 40 mature trees. The same local authority went down the same street not very long afterwards and chopped down every single tree in the street. Now, what you see here is something that doesn't make sense as a finished product, but both of those decisions made by the local authority would have made sense at the time. They took extra time, effort and money, and the people making that decision were doing their best. Now, why am I showing you this on a webinar about KPIs? Well, I've had a long career working in lots of different organisations spanning banking, manufacturing, healthcare, aerospace, all kinds of different sectors. And what we see in every case is just this with KPIs. People trying their best, doing the very best that they can in the situation they're in to make the right decision. But the overall system, the system of KPIs, the reporting doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, having seen this issue many, many times over my career, I set myself a challenge, which was, is it possible to create a universal, simple method for designing KPIs that works for any organisation? So it's independent of sector or country, and someone trained in this method can pick it up and use it to confidently arrive at meaningful KPIs. So that's what we're going to be covering in today's session. It's a lot to fit in 45 minutes, so I apologise if I talk quickly. There will be a recording of this on YouTube, and you'll also get a follow-up email with the link in as well. Now, our plan for today is very simple. We are going to walk through the 7 steps that I've developed to design meaningful KPIs. I'm going to tell you some short stories along the way to hopefully bring those steps to life and explain why they're there. And along the way, I'm going to give you 7 practical tips. Now, it's been a real struggle to condense everything down to 7 tips. It won't give you everything that you need, but don't worry. I am going to signpost where you can get more information as we go along. Okay, so next, let's take a look. Okay, yeah, so I would encourage you to stick around to the end, because not only am I going to share where you can get more material for free, for low cost, I'm also going to give you some details on our really in-depth black belt program. Not going to give the hard sell, but I will outline where you can go to find out more information and a fantastic discount code offer. Okay, now for the information I'm going to talk about, what you can do is use this QR code and that will take you to a mini site, and it enables you to go to our main website, get free materials, to look at the black belt, to book a meeting with me, and also giving away some free samples of some of the more interesting concepts like KPI trees. So that QR code is your gateway to everything I'm talking about in today's session. Now, I'm going to very briefly introduce myself. I'm Bernie Smith. I'm the founder of Made to Measure KPIs. I'm a professional engineer by training. I spent many years in operational process improvement across multiple sectors, and I spotted this challenge with KPIs about 20 years ago and decided that making KPIs accessible, logical, explainable was my mission. And along the way, I've written 21 books on KPIs. There's a few more in the pipeline as well. But today we are going to talk about my core methodology. Now, to help you understand where that comes from, I'm going to ask you to imagine that you are in your local DIY superstore. So in the UK, it's B&Q, in Saudi Arabia, it'd be Saku. In every country seems to have a store like this, Home Depot in the US. Now, if I set you the challenge and said, imagine that the store has been opened just for you, and your challenge is to run and retrieve the single most useful tool in the store. Now take a moment and think about what you would choose. I've run this session hundreds of times, and you get a range of answers, from a hammer through to a screwdriver, through to a multi-tool kit, through to a shop assistant. They're all good answers, but the question is flawed. The best tool in the store depends very much on what it is you're trying to do. If you're putting up a shelf, then a screwdriver might be useful. If you're trying to put up wallpaper, a screwdriver is considerably less useful. With a multi-tool kit, we all know, anyone who's bought one, there's tools in there you never use, and often you're missing the crucial tool. So when you go tool shopping, the logical thing to do is to start with your intent or the result that you want in mind. And that is the key to meaningful KPIs as well. And I came up with the worst named process in the world, the results orientated KPI system. It's put simply working backwards from the outcome that you want to choose the right KPIs, just like choosing the right tools for a DIY job. Now, because that's such a terrible name, we need an abbreviation, and that abbreviation is the ROCKS method. Now, you may be new to the ROCKS method, but it's out there and being used by some very big names. You'll see it spans professional sports leagues, aircraft manufacturers, investment banking, sovereign wealth funds, and many, many more. So all of these organizations are using some form of the ROCKS method in part or all of their organization. And I'm going to walk you through those 7 steps with a few stories along the way. So these are the 7 steps. Nothing particularly mysterious or technical, but I will explain why each step is there and give you a tip on each one as we go through. So our first step logically has to be having a clear strategy. If we don't know what we want to achieve, we can't really do anything else. Now, this is a step that people will often rush through or make mistakes on. And to use that old curse, be careful what you wish for, because you often don't get what you intended, even if you think you've worded it properly. Now, I share a story when I do this training about India in the 1800s. And legend has it that the governor of a major city decided that he wanted to reduce the number of venomous snakes, reduce the number of cobras in the wild. So he offered a reward, and he offered a reward for dead cobras. The idea was the local population would hunt cobras, bring them to the town hall for a reward, and they'd eventually reduce the cobra population. Now, this worked as intended for a little while. However, the local population became extremely good at hunting cobras, and the cobra population plunged. Now, if you're a successful cobra hunter, bringing in good rewards, and your raw material runs out, what's the logical thing to do? It is, of course, to start farming cobras. So the supply of cobras was resumed, the population were getting their bounty for bringing dead cobras to the town hall, and everything was fine for a little while. But then the governor got wind of this, and he did the logical thing, which is to stop paying the reward. Whereupon the locals did the logical thing of releasing their now worthless stock into the wild. So at the end of this, the governor had paid out a large amount of public funds, and the wild cobra population actually increased. Now, this story may or may not be true, but it is directly equivalent to many of the problems that I've seen with my clients having with their strategic objectives, where a small deviation in the statement of strategy leads to a big change in outcomes. Now, in this case, the mistake that was made was their implied strategy was to offer a bounty for cobras. Their correct strategy should have been to offer a bounty for dead wild cobras. And that small distinction made the difference between eliminating dangerous wild cobras and costing a lot of money and actually increasing the population. Now, a very everyday example might be we decide to be environmental, And a lot of people would say, let's be green. Now, to me, that might make sense. To someone else, it could have very different implications because the English language, or any language, is ambiguous. So we need to concisely and precisely articulate what we want to happen. So it might be that we work to minimise our carbon emissions or work to minimise our greenhouse gas emissions. We need meaningful, clear statements that reduce ambiguity. So that brings us to my first tip, which is when you're defining your statements, strategy statements, be precise and clear with your language, and using statements of outcome make this easier. So clear, explanatory language that states what you want to happen. Now, the next step was not in my first take of the ROCKS plan. I learnt the hard way that engagement is one of the most important, if not the most important element of KPI design and adoption. Now, I learned the hard way, and I haven't got time to go into that story in too much detail, but in terms of solving the challenge of engagement, I learned a lot from one of my consulting friends early in my career. Now, my friend, he would drive onto a manufacturing site on a Monday, help clients improve their processes by working with a team of operators, technicians, and supervisors to improve the process. He drove to his site on a Monday morning and he saw a scene like this. The factory was on fire. Now, it was nothing to do with the work that the team had been doing. It was a build-up of fat in an air vent that had caught fire. It had caused a lot of damage, and my friend got out of his car and he saw his team dressed in their white overalls for food manufacturing in one corner of the car park, which was the evacuation area. He walked towards them, and the supervisor walked towards him and said, it's a disaster. You can see we've lost half the factory. It's going to take us several weeks to get up and running. Lines 3, 4, and 5 are down. 7 and 8, we can get up and running, but they're not great. And his head was down, and his mood was low. And then his head came up, and his mood lifted. He said, but we managed to save the flip charts. And that team had gone back into a still smouldering building to rescue the work that they had been doing. And for me, this was an eye-opener. How do you get a team to be that engaged in what they're doing? And speaking with my friend, I identified 3 core principles, and this brings us on to tip number 2. Firstly, you must not leave people out. So you need to accurately and effectively identify all the people who need to be involved as early as possible. Then you need to get the right level of involvement. The chief executive may be deeply interested, but he or she may only have 5 minutes for a quick update, whereas people closely involved in the data collection or running of the process may want real deep dive involvement. And you need to assess that level of involvement and get it right. And then finally, I've already given this one away, engage the team as early as possible. The later you leave it, the more you get folded arms, angry people finding reasons why it won't work, why they've been shunned, and why they should have been included earlier. So the thread that runs throughout the whole of this approach, and in fact all of the work that I do, is it has to be owned within the business. So don't get consultants to do it for you, get them to help you. And you need to identify key stakeholders and get them properly involved as early as possible. Now, this would be stage 1 or step 1 if we didn't have to know what we were doing to find the right people to involve. So it's right up there, and that's why it's the very next step after designing our strategy. So far we've talked about strategy, what we want to happen, and we've talked about engagement. And I've just given you 3 basic tips there and emphasized just how important it is to have people engaged as early as possible. Now we get on to the bit where we actually talk about KPIs. Now, this is actually split into 2 parts. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is there are 2 types of people in the world. There are the dreamers, and these are often senior people, and they're often people who don't have to produce the actual business intelligence management information themselves or have had no involvement. And often they love to have lots of KPIs because it gives them great visibility, a feeling of control. Now, the other type of person you have is what I call the pragmatists. And these are people who often know how difficult and complicated it is to produce metrics. If you try and select KPIs with both types of people in the room in a single step, you're very likely to have high levels of conflict. I'm being polite here. You're going to have a fight. So what we do is we actually split this process into 2 steps. We have a step for the dreamers, and we call that long listing. And that's where we create lots and lots of KPIs, excuse me, lots and lots of KPIs, which we could measure, but we're not going to measure anything like all of them. In fact, we may only measure 5 or 10% of them. Then we have shortlisting, which is where the pragmatists have their day, and we'll come on to that in a moment. So how do we come up with the long list? Well, I'm going to use an example I've used hundreds of times before, but I think it quite nicely explains the approach. We all can relate to the strategic objective, personal strategic objective of being healthy. So what I'm going to show you is something called a KPI tree, which I created in 2012 based on Kaplan and Norton strategy mapping. But this is designed in a way to support KPI design for real life, huge organizations. And a KPI tree works like this. At the top, we have the outcome that we're looking for. Now, being healthy is definitely important. I don't think anyone would argue with that, but it is not directly measurable. It's got lots of elements to it. So what we need to do is we need to break down that into constituent parts. So outcomes that are going to drive towards being healthy. Now, being healthy involves exercise, it involves getting enough sleep, it involves relaxing, and of course, it involves eating well. Now, again, eating well is not a statement that anyone's going to argue with, but it's also something you can't measure directly. So again, we need to break it down, and we could break it down into getting the right balance of fat, carbohydrates, and protein, getting enough minerals and vitamins, and of course, as someone who likes burgers and doesn't do enough exercise, managing calorie intake. So one of the elements of eating well is managing calorie intake, and eating well is one of the elements of being healthy. Now, finally, we get to something we can measure directly. So we can measure calories consumed. We can count calories. We can weigh our food, we can read the packet and see how much energy is in there, and so on. Now, is calories consumed the only measure of being healthy? Absolutely not. So what we need to do is we need to scale. And here you can see a simple tree built on these principles, including some of the things I've already mentioned. So we're getting the right amount of quality sleep, being in a relaxed state on a regular basis, minimizing unhealthy habits, so smoking, drinking, perhaps caffeine, eating well, being aerobically fit, and managing or losing weight. Now, this isn't definitive. We could also have strength in there as well as physical fitness, and there may be other elements as well. And I'm not going to talk through the whole tree, but you can easily download this for free from the Made to Measure KPIs website. So that QR code will point you in the right direction for the website, and you'll find it there for free for your use. But what I will point out is these things are connected. And for example, I like to drink beer. Now, beer might be good for my relaxation. It's not great for my quality of sleep. It's not great for energy intake, the famous beer belly, and it's not great for managing unhealthy habits like consuming alcohol. So what we do when we have this kind of outcome or result that is important, but it's negative, we show it with a red link. Now, there's a couple of important points here. What we're doing with that KPI tree is showing the relationship between outcomes. And that's really important for real world organizations because things are linked. We all know that if you push your customer service agents to handle calls more quickly, you may see a reduction in call handling quality, in customer satisfaction, and in first touch resolution, for example. So there are complex relationships in businesses, and the KPI tree enables us to show those relationships, show how they interact, and start to think about some of the balancing act that happens when we start to set targets later on. Now, KPI trees are a learned skill. Honestly, the best way to learn it is hands-on. being coached to do it, which is one of the things we do in the KPI Black Belt. However, I give away a lot of free material on the website. There's a very in-depth guide as well, and if you type in KPI trees, it's normally number one on Google, so you can make a start yourself. The tip for this step is break down your high-level strategic outcomes into measurable results, and do that using a KPI tree. And you will find a simple finance and also manufacturing KPI tree sample at kpi.contact. That's that little website which the QR code will take you to. They're free, you can download them straight away. Excuse me. So at this point, the pragmatists are starting to panic. The practical people, often the management information team, are looking a little bit unhappy, a little bit queasy, because it's not uncommon to come up with 6, 7, or 800 KPIs in the long list stage. Now, that may sound like waste, but it does two things. It enables the group to build a consensus about how things work and what outcomes we're looking for, and that is incredibly valuable for building group agreement and group alignment. It also means that when we choose our short list of KPIs, we can be confident that we've considered as much as possible. We haven't overlooked anything. So although this feels like a long-winded way of doing it, it is a fantastic way of finalising our KPI list and also having a useful reference document if the situation changes, if we decide to expand our KPI selection at a later date, or we need to go back and audit why we chose the KPIs that we did. So 6, 7, 800 KPIs. Now we come on to the step where the pragmatists will start to feel a bit more comfortable. And we do it using a very simple concept that I created in KPI Checklist, my first book, called the shortlisting matrix. And we take each of those blue boxes from the KPI tree, so those are candidate KPIs, and we score them based on how important they are and how practical and easy they are to measure. So for example, cash in bank is a vital KPI at a board level, well in fact any kind of company level, but the FD will spend a lot of time making sure that we have enough cash. So that's a 10 for importance, and it's often an 8, 9 or 10 for ease of measurement. So that lives in the top right hand corner of our matrix. Now, where this matrix becomes valuable is in identifying how we deal with different types of score. The bottom left hand corner is very easy. It's typically empty. Things that are impossible to measure and not important, they may not, well, they probably won't even make the KPI trees. So that's pretty straightforward. The KPIs in the top right hand corner, they're easy. These are things that are both important and practical and easy to measure. So if we're not already measuring them, we want to go right ahead and pop those on the candidate list for our dashboards and reports. The two other zones is where it starts to get interesting. So the bottom right hand corner, these are things that are easy but not that important. Now, you may be wondering why we have KPIs there at all. And honestly, it's a growing problem. And the reason is systems. So if you have a new ERM system or ERP system or CRM system, you will find that there are pre-built reports that the vendors can often switch on at no effort or cost to themselves that will swamp you with data and with information. And the human brain is not designed to cope with vast amounts of numerical data. So anything that's in the bottom right hand corner, we need to seriously think about scratching. I work with one major telecoms firm, and the team leaders, who typically manage a team of 7 to 10 people, were expected to sit down with their team at the start of the shift and review the operational report. It had 128 KPIs in. Now, having a meaningful, brief team conversation with your team to discuss 128 KPIs is not practical. So many of those KPIs, I suspect, would live in that bottom right-hand corner. So we've got the KPIs we want to go ahead with. We've got the KPIs that we should seriously think about ditching, and we've got the dead zone of hard and not important. That brings us on to what I call the gold bar quadrant. That's their top left-hand corner. And these are KPIs that are both important and apparently very hard to measure or possibly impossible. That means that most of the time, without this process, people will discard them. They'll just go, it's impossible, and they won't go any further with them. And that is a massive mistake. If you come away with one concept from today's session, I hope it's this one, that there are many, many KPIs which could transform your business, give you a massive competitive advantage that you may dismiss as impossible when in fact they are actually measurable. Now let me give you an example. I work with a pension provider. They operated a contact centre, as many of these do, and this was before the days of internet self-service. I was sat in an operations meeting listening to a discussion about a sudden increase in the number of people transferring their pensions to competitor organisations. That's a big problem. And they were having a fairly deep discussion about this. And one of the middle managers threw up his hands and said, it's not like we can read our customers' minds. There's no way we can tell if someone's about to leave. He started laughing at his own joke. And then a voice at the back piped up. And it was from one of the process improvement team. And she said, actually, I think there is a way we can spot this. And what she'd identified was that there was one bit of behaviour that their customers exhibited just before they transferred their pension out of the organisation. And that activity was contacting the call centre for a valuation of their pension pot. Now, as I said, this is before internet self-service, so they would call up and ask what their pension pot was. Now, interestingly, this observation also explained why it increased. They changed that process from a live human agent looking it up and giving it to the customer to a self-service where a robot will ring out the amount after inbound verification. So, not only did it explain why it had increased, it also highlighted a very short-term leading indicator of intent to leave. Not everyone who called up for evaluation was going to leave, but almost everyone who called up for who intended to leave was planning to call up and get a valuation before they did so. So what they did was they put their very best customer service representatives onto those calls and switched off the self-service. Now, the key point here is that there are often things that happen around your impossible measure, in this case intent to leave, that will show you what's about to happen. It requires a very different mindset to spot and make these measurable, but it's worth the effort because these kinds of KPIs can be business making or business breaking. So please be very careful about dismissing something as being impossible to measure without giving it a good go. Now, I've got to just mention, during the KPI Black Belt, we devote a whole module to this using a 3-step process I've created called the Holmes method, which I've so far found makes absolutely everything measurable. There isn't a single thing that we've not been able to measure using the Holmes method. So my tip for shortlisting is focus on those gold bar KPIs. Do not discard something just because it looks hard to measure. Now, you can only typically measure 1, 2, or 3 very hard things or work on them at a time. But typically, if you get the shortlisting right, they are worth the effort. Okay, so by this point, we've got a carefully honed shortlist of KPIs, but they are just descriptions. They are just labels. It might be efficiency, it might be utilization, it might be complaint rate. Now, that brings us on to definition, and my experience tells me that many organisations nod vigorously when you discuss definition, and they all agree it's important, and then they don't define their KPIs. And I'm going to share an example with you of how that can be career limiting and potentially very, very dangerous for the organisation. Now, I was working with a large global engineering consulting firm, and they had 4 regional directors who looked after the operation, let's say in EMEA, North America, APAC, and the Middle East. So we had 4 global regions. And being a professional services business, they were very interested in how much they charged their consultants out for and how busy those consultants were. And one of their key metrics was utilization. So utilization, if you haven't come across it, is how busy someone was versus how many hours they had available. So if I sell my time and I have 30 hours available to sell in the week, and I build out for 15 of those hours, then my utilization is 50%. Now, if my costs are managed correctly, if my billing rate is high enough per hour and my utilization is good, you're going to make money. So this is why it's so important. Now, I sat in on a global meeting for the 4 regions, and in this session, the 4 regional heads came in, and there was the global head of operations. Expensive meeting. Flew in business class, a lot of time out the office, very expensive resource. And these meetings were pretty unpleasant. And the reason was, one of the regional heads, for the sake of argument, let's say North America, his utilization was significantly lower than the other 3 regions. And each operations meeting, there was a focus on America, and a recovery plan was put in place. And the head of America was working very hard to implement that recovery plan. And we saw his utilization creeping up, but he was on the ropes. He was pretty close to being fired. And then we looked at the measure. And what we discovered was the predecessor in the Americas had decided to employ admin staff, 1 admin person per 3 engineers, to relieve the engineers of non-value add tasks like invoicing and writing proposals and photocopying and things like that. Now, this person had decided to go with a hard measure and include the available hours for the admin assistant in the total available hours. Now, of course, these were non-billing staff, so it meant that the Americas could only ever achieve 75% utilization. Now, the other 3 regions didn't do this. When we recalculated the Americas utilization on the same basis as the other 3 regions, they weren't the weakest performing region, they were the best performing region. So, because we had 2 different versions of the same KPI, so 2 different definitions, we'd spent months discussing a problem that did not exist and almost fired our best performing region. So it can be career threatening, it can be site threatening, it can be business threatening. And I've seen many, many other examples of identical sounding KPIs being calculated in different ways in the same organization. Fortunately, the key to it is simple, if a little bit dull, and that is to use a KPI canvas. Again, you'll find plenty of information on made-to-measure-kpis.com using the QR code, but there you can see we've got some basic questions that we need to answer about the KPI. Now, I won't go through this in detail, but we start with a unique name. We talk about precisely where the data comes from, because there's often many ways of getting the same answer in an organization. We have the definition, which is important, but also crucially, we record what is included and excluded from the KPI. And that, from my experience, is the most common source of variance between KPI implementation in different parts of a business. So really important. Then we talk about problems and errors. All KPIs come with baggage, with issues. We document them. And we'll also document things like who's involved in production, how much it costs to produce, what targets we set, and what outcomes we're looking for. So that's a free template which you can download. There's also a more sophisticated version which I share with my black belts during the program. So my 5th tip and our 5th step, definition: define your critical KPIs first. It can be overwhelming to define every KPI. There's often hundreds in an organization. So start with the ones that you are making critical business decisions based on. It might be efficiency, it might be sales figures, it might be utilization. So go through and assess the risk in your more commonly used KPIs, start with those, and then manage your KPIs like you would manage your balance sheet. You need to stay on top of them and be confident that you are measuring things in a consistent, repeatable and comparable way. Now, this session is a little bit unusual because I'm actually going to cover all 7 steps. I'll normally stop at this point, but I just want to give you a flavour of steps 6 and 7. Now, step 6 is called prototyping, and this is about designing dashboards and reports that are quick, simple and easy to understand properly and support good decision making. Now, the reason it's called prototyping is I learnt the hard way that you don't go into production with a dashboard you haven't tested. Doing so creates an awful lot of rework. People saying, we want this, changing their mind, and perhaps tying your BI team up for weeks, if not months, rebuilding a Power BI, Click or Tableau dashboard. So we have a detailed methodology about the steps that you go through to prototype, test and implement your KPI dashboards. There's a lot to it. And interestingly, there's a lot of cognitive theory behind it. There are rules and principles that we can use to help people understand it, but also to break their comprehension. So I have just picked one slide here, maybe to provoke a little bit of thought on this topic. It is a big topic, and I run entire programs just on visual design. But let me share this with you. If you go back to the early 1900s and you bought a Model T Ford and you looked at the pedals on the floor of that vehicle, you would find the left pedal is the clutch, the central pedal is the reverse, and the right pedal is the brake. Now, if a few short years earlier, you were in a Wilson Pilcher, a 1904 Wilson Pilcher, you would find that the central pedal is the accelerator, but you accelerate by lifting it rather than pushing it. If you then got in a 1918 Stutz Bearcat, you would find the left pedal is a brake, the central pedal is a push throttle, and the right pedal is a clutch. Now, I can't even imagine having to rewire my brain to drive these 3 vehicles in quick succession. But my challenge to you is look at the management reports that you see every day in your organisation and ask yourself the question, do we move things? Do we have a consistent logical layout, or are we doing the psychological equivalent of moving the pedals on our vehicle in between our team looking at reports and dashboards? Do they jump from the ops report, which is laid out in one way, to a finance report that's laid out in another way, to a sales report that's laid out in a third way? And my experience is, unless the organisation has thought carefully about this idea and implemented standards and rules for doing so, there's a very good chance that every report is different, and possibly every page within a report is laid out differently, presented differently, and honestly, it confuses people. It makes things harder. It makes decision making less reliable. So there's a lot to this, and there's some good books. For instance, Stephen Few's Information Dashboard Design and Edward Tufte. There's lots of theory behind it. Fortunately, a lot of thought has already been put into this, and there's a ISO standard in progress, delivered or developed by the International Business Communication Standard. So I suggest you head to ibcs.com if you are interested in finding out, discovering a standards-based way of designing reports and dashboards. And if you want to find out more about this topic, just drop me a line and I will happily share some more information with you. Now, our final step is the biggest step. So if you take my book, KPI Checklist, this is half the book. It's huge. So I just decided to pick one tip from my experience. Typically, Go Live is a blend of communication and engagement management, so getting people warmed up and ready for it, project management, and also troubleshooting. There are a number of quite predictable problems that come up whenever you implement KPIs. So if you do decide to check out my book or join the Black Belt course, we'll go into this in quite a lot of detail. But one of the things that I've found is when you do implement KPIs, it's the small stuff that counts. So if someone's confused, if something breaks, if something's not clear, if someone has their trust shaken in a particular figure, that's a moment of truth. It's a really important point in the implementation. And it's really important to be available, to be present, and to be open, and to fix or address those issues as fast as possible and as politely and friendly as possible. Friendly? I'm not sure that's a word. In as friendly and open way as possible. So my final tip on step 7, going live, is do sweat the small stuff, particularly when you're just starting to implement your KPIs and your dashboards and reports. Focus on detail, talk to people, listen, iron out the small glitches, the small problems. It will massively increase buy-in, and it will greatly increase the chance of adoption. And for that reason, it's always advisable not to focus too broadly, not to try and do too much, but to do a little bit well, and then come back and revisit further KPIs, more scope, once you've settled in and got people bought in to that initial, slightly less ambitious goal. So that's a whistle-stop tour through the 7 steps. There's a lot to them. The black belt is 20 hours of e-learning spread across 13 modules and 4 months with practical hands-on exercises and tutorials. And we deep dive into every element of what you've seen, and also things like target and incentive design and index design and all sorts of other interesting topics. But coming back to our opening question, is it possible to create a universal simple method for designing KPIs that works for any organisation? I can't say for sure, but in every organisation I've worked in, spanning sovereign wealth funds through to banking, through to supermarkets, through to polyethylene cracking, we've used this approach successfully to take their strategic objectives and develop meaningful KPIs, because it's principle led. It's based on what we want to happen. So it's flexible and it works in any situation where you can define what you want. Now, I'm going to give you 3 options here to take this a bit further. Hopefully you found it really interesting and would like to find out a bit more. There's a free option. So if you head to kpi.contact, which is where that QR code will take you, you will find links to Made to Measure KPIs. That's the 3rd link down. You'll find details of the Black Belt program at the top, and I'll give you a code for that in a moment. You can book a half-hour free, no pressure call with me if you want to have a chat about things. That's the 2nd button down there. You can find my books, and also at the bottom you'll see 2 free KPI trees that you can just download directly and use to help you understand the approach. And of course you can follow me on LinkedIn if you don't already do so, using that little button at the top, or send me an email. Now, if you're feeling a little bit more extravagant, KPI Checklist is the first port of call. It's available on Amazon, Apple, you can get it on Audible, you can get it on Kindle, paperback and hardback, and so on. And for not very much money, that will take you through the 7 steps of the method in a bit more detail. It's a 3.5 hour read, so the audiobook's about 3.5 hours long, and it will take similar to read through the book. Now, if you, say, are a BI consultant who really wants to be able to use this stuff with their clients, you want to get mastery of it, or perhaps you've got an internal KPI team that is challenged with implementing KPIs, then the KPI Black Belt is the way to go. It's a hybrid course, so it's e-learning mixed with practical assignments, mixed with live tutorials. It's the thing I get up in the morning looking forward to doing. So every 6 months, I run a new cohort, so strictly limited places, and you get a nice trophy at the end of it. And this code is valid until midnight tonight. So use that. If you don't feel able to move right now, book a meeting with me and that will lock the code in. You will be able to use that right up until the last space goes. It is selling out quickly, so I would suggest you get in there quickly. But there we go. The 7 steps of creating meaningful KPIs, 3 options for finding out more. As I said before, head to kpi.contact. That is your gateway to all of the material I've talked about today. It's a lot in 45 minutes. If you stuck around to the end, thank you very much. I appreciate that. If you've got any questions, just ping me. I love talking to people. So thanks everyone and have a great day.